The document fell from Theresa Garrison's hands and scattered across the dusty floorboards of the Millhaven County Courthouse, and she did not move to pick it up. She stood completely still, her chest heaving beneath her gray traveling dress, staring at the man across the long oak table who had just told her that everything she had traveled 900 miles to do was built on a lie. "Say that again," she said, her voice low and dangerous in a way she had not known she was capable of producing. "Say it to my face one more time, Mr. Donnelly, so I am absolutely certain I heard you correctly." Perry Donnelly did not flinch. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, with calloused hands wrapped around the brim of a weathered hat he held in front of him like a shield he did not really need. His jaw was set in a hard line beneath several days of dark stubble, and his eyes, which were the particular deep brown of river water after a storm, met hers without apology and without retreat. "What I said, Miss Garrison, is that your uncle never intended for you to inherit that estate at all. What I said is that he made arrangements with me, in writing, 3 months before he died, arrangements that your lawyer in Cincinnati somehow neglected to mention to you before he put you on that train. And what I said, which I will absolutely repeat as many times as you require, is that if you had read the secondary codicil attached to the will rather than only the primary document, you would have known that the Vance property was already spoken for before you ever packed your trunk." The room felt as though the walls had contracted. Theresa could hear the faint sound of horses on the street outside, the distant creak of a wagon wheel, the ordinary sounds of Millhaven, Texas, going about its ordinary afternoon, while her entire understanding of her situation collapsed inward like a structure with a rotten foundation. She had come here carrying exactly $42, a one-way train ticket stub, and the certainty that settling her late Uncle Harold Vance's estate would provide her with enough resources to begin a new life. She had left Cincinnati with nothing waiting for her there. A broken engagement, a position as a schoolteacher ended by the sudden closure of the school, and a landlady who had been very polite about the fact that Theresa's rent was 2 months overdue. She had nothing to go back to. She had come west because the letter from the lawyer had seemed like a door opening precisely when every other door had shut. And now, this man was telling her the door had never existed. 3 weeks earlier, Theresa had been sitting in the small, overheated office of Mr. Raymond Colby, attorney at law, on the 4th floor of a brick building on Vine Street in Cincinnati. The letter from Millhaven had arrived on a Tuesday, and by Thursday she had confirmed what it said. Her Uncle Harold Vance, whom she had met exactly twice in her life, once at a family gathering when she was 7 years old and once at her mother's funeral 6 years ago, had died without close family. He had a cattle ranch and a house and some acres of land outside a small Texas town, and since Theresa was the nearest living relative the lawyers could locate, she was named as the primary beneficiary in the will. Mr. Colby had explained it all very crisply and efficiently. He had not mentioned a secondary codicil. He had not mentioned Perry Donnelly. She had told herself, on the long rocking journey through Missouri and into the territory, that she was not a woman who fell apart. She had grown up in a household where falling apart was considered a moral failing. Her father had been a Presbyterian minister with very decided views about composure, and whatever else Theresa had absorbed from his teaching, she had certainly absorbed the conviction that grief and panic were things to be managed privately and quickly, like a small fire in a confined space, stamped out before it could spread. She bent down now and picked up the documents from the floor. She straightened them against the table with precise, controlled movements. She looked at Perry Donnelly. "I would like to see this secondary codicil," she said. "I have it here," he said, and drew a folded paper from the inside pocket of his coat. He placed it on the table and pushed it toward her without coming any closer than was strictly necessary, as though he understood that she needed space and had decided to respect that without being asked. Theresa noted it without intending to. She read the document carefully. It was legible, properly witnessed, dated the 14th of March, 1882, which was indeed 3 months before Harold Vance's death in June. It stipulated that in the event of his death, the grazing rights to the southern pasture and the water access along Cutter Creek were to pass to Perry Donnelly of the Double D Ranch in exchange for $2,000 paid to the estate, which was to be held in trust pending the arrival of the primary heir. The house and the northern acreage remained Theresa's, but without the southern grazing and the creek water, the cattle operation was functionally impossible to sustain. She set the document down. "The house," she said, "the northern acreage. Yours," Perry said, "no question about it. And the water, the main well on the house property is yours. The creek access is what the codicil addresses, which means the cattle cannot be maintained without negotiating with you. Which means," he said carefully, "that the 43 head of cattle currently on the Vance property need to be either sold or relocated within a reasonable period of time, yes." Theresa was quiet for a moment. Outside, a horse whinnied, and someone called out a greeting to someone else in a cheerful voice that felt obscenely out of place. "I have $42, she said. She had not planned to say it. It came out of her mouth with the flat simplicity of a statement of geological fact. The sky is blue, water flows downhill. I have $42. I used the last of my savings to purchase my train ticket and to retain a modest room at what your town's establishment calls a hotel, but which I suspect a more careful reviewer might classify differently. I came here expecting to liquidate an estate that would have provided me with enough money to start over somewhere. The house, if it can be sold at a reasonable price, will provide some of that. But without being able to represent the full operation, including the grazing and the water rights, I cannot attract a buyer who will pay anything approaching what it is actually worth." Perry Donnelly looked at her for a long moment. Something moved behind his eyes that she could not quite read, and she found, to her own irritation, that she wanted to. "Miss Garrison," he said, "I did not know you were coming into this situation without full information. I assumed your lawyer had explained the complete picture. If I had known otherwise, I am not interested in what you would have done differently," Theresa said, which was not entirely true, but she needed to hold herself together, and she had found over the years that precision of language was a useful tool for that purpose. "I am interested in what the situation actually is and what can practically be done about it." He pulled out the chair on his side of the table and sat down in it. He turned his hat over in his hands once and then set it on the table. He looked at her with an expression that was not quite sympathy and not quite calculation, but something in between that she did not have a ready word for. "Sit down," he said. It was not a command. It was an invitation offered in a plain way that somehow made it easier to accept. She sat. "Here is what I know," Perry said. "Your Uncle Harold was not a bad man, but he was not a well man in his last year. He made some decisions toward the end that he might not have made in full health. The arrangement with me was one of them. I paid him the $2,000 as agreed because he needed cash quickly and I needed the creek access to keep my own operation viable, and the transaction was legal and witnessed and recorded at this courthouse. I'm not going to apologize for it." "I haven't asked you to," Theresa said. "No," he agreed. "You haven't. What I am also going to tell you is this. The arrangement doesn't have to be the end of the story. The Vance house is a sound structure. The northern pasture is decent land. The well is reliable. A person with some determination and a reasonable plan could build something workable out of what remains, and I suspect from everything about how you are sitting in that chair right now that determination is not something you are short of." Theresa looked at him. "Are you attempting to console me, Mr. Donnelly?" "No, ma'am," he said. "I am attempting to be accurate." She found, to her profound annoyance, that she almost smiled. The Millhaven Hotel was a 2-story building with a wooden facade, painted a color that had once been white and was now the beige of old teeth. Theresa's room had a narrow bed, a washstand with a blue and white pitcher, a window that looked out over the main street, and a hook on the back of the door for her coat. It was clean, which she valued above all the other things it was not, and the woman who ran it, Mrs. Eugenia Holt, was a compact and practical person of around 50 who had looked Theresa over with the efficient assessment of someone deciding whether a new tool was the right size for the job at hand, and had apparently concluded that it was. That first evening, Theresa sat at the small desk in her room and made a list. She was good at lists. She had been making lists since she was 14, when her mother had died and her father's grief had temporarily displaced his competence, and someone in the household had needed to manage things. Lists made the unmanageable manageable. They turned a cloud of fear into a series of discrete tasks, each of which could be addressed in sequence. The list she made now had 2 columns. On the left, she wrote what she had: a house, northern acreage, a well. $42 minus the cost of 3 nights at the hotel, which Mrs. Holt had told her was 50 cents a night, so $39.50. The 43 head of cattle whose legal ownership she needed to confirm, but who currently existed on a property whose water situation made their maintenance complicated. The name and signature of Perry Donnelly on a document that gave him something she needed to work with if she was going to make anything of what remained. On the right side of the paper she wrote what she did not have: knowledge of cattle, knowledge of ranching, knowledge of Texas, any person in Millhaven she could call a friend or an ally. A plan. She studied the right side of the list for a while, then she added one more item. She wrote in her small, neat schoolteacher's handwriting the word options, and she underlined it. And she went asleep thinking about what would happen if she went back to Cincinnati with $39.50 and nothing waiting for her there. She decided that she was not going to find out. The next morning she went to the Vance property for the first time. It was 4 miles outside town, and she hired a horse at the livery stable, paying $1 for the day and feeling the weight of the expenditure with every cent. The road was dry and pale, and the land on either side of it was a wide open thing that she had not expected. She had grown up among trees, among the enclosed green spaces of Ohio, where the horizon was always blocked by something. Here the sky went on for so long in every direction that it felt slightly aggressive, as though the landscape was asking something of her that she was not sure she knew how to give. The Vance house was a low, solid structure built of rough limestone with a covered front porch and 2 chimneys. It had a barn behind it, unpainted and functional, and a chicken coop that appeared to currently be occupied based on the sounds coming from it. The well was to the left of the house with a proper rope and wooden bucket. The northern pasture was visible through a split-rail fence, and it was bigger than she had expected, rolling away toward a line of scrubby live oak trees in the distance. She dismounted, tied the horse to the porch rail, and stood looking at the place for a long time. A man came out of the barn. He was weathered in the particular way of men who spent all their time outdoors, deeply lined around the eyes, with a permanent squint and hands that looked like they were made of braided rope. He was perhaps 60, perhaps older, with a salt and pepper mustache and a wary expression. "You'll be the niece," he said. "Theresa Garrison," she said. "And you are?" "Caleb Prout," he said. "I worked the place, worked it for Harold going on 11 years. I suppose I'm part of what you've inherited, in the sense of I'm here and willing to stay if the situation warrants." She studied him. "Were you aware of the arrangement with Perry Donnelly, the secondary codicil about the creek water and the southern grazing?" Caleb Prout's expression was its own complicated answer. He shifted his weight, looked at the barn for a moment, and looked back at her. "I knew Harold was thinking about some arrangement with the Donnelly operation. Harold wasn't in a position toward the end to work the full spread the way it needed working. Some kind of consolidation seemed sensible." "But you didn't know the specific terms?" "No, ma'am," she nodded. "This was information, even if it was uncomfortable information." "Tell me about the cattle," she said. He told her. 43 head, a mixture of longhorns and some shorter-legged cattle that Harold had been experimenting with for beef quality purposes. 3 working horses besides the one she had hired. A mule. "The chickens, which numbered around 20 and produced eggs that Caleb had been selling to the hotel and to 2 families in town, which netted him barely enough to buy supplies, but had kept the operation limping along in the weeks since Harold's death. "The cattle need the southern pasture for grazing," Caleb said. "The northern pasture's good land, but it's not enough for 43 head long-term, not in this summer heat, and without the creek for watering." He stopped. "I understand," Theresa said. She walked around the property for 2 hours, looking at everything, measuring her ignorance against the scale of the task. She was not a person who frightened easily, but she was a person who thought clearly, and her clear thinking kept arriving at the same conclusion, which was that the situation as she had inherited it was not viable in its current form, and that the only person in the county who could change that calculus was Perry Donnelly. She did not like that conclusion. She noted it, filed it, and rode back to town. She found him at the feed store, which seemed like an improbable location for a confrontation, but which was where she found him, loading sacks of grain into a wagon with the systematic efficiency of a man who had done it so many times that his body simply knew what to do without requiring instruction. He looked up when she came in, and the expression on his face was difficult to describe, but it involved no surprise, which told her he had been thinking about her situation in the hours since the courthouse. "Miss Garrison," he said. He kept moving the sacks. "I need to speak with you," she said. "I know," he said. He set down the sack in his hands and turned to face her properly. He was slightly dusty from the work, and he had tied his horse to the rail outside with the same casual competence that seemed to characterize everything he did. "Do you want to go somewhere more formal, or are you comfortable having a business conversation in the feed store?" "I don't stand on formality when time is practical," Theresa said. "What I want to propose is this. You have the grazing rights and the creek access. I have the northern pasture and the house and 43 head of cattle I cannot adequately support with what I have. The logical arrangement, until I can get the estate in a form that is saleable at a fair price, is some kind of temporary agreement that allows me to use the southern pasture and the creek in exchange for something I can offer you." Perry looked at her steadily. "What are you thinking of offering?" She had thought about this on the ride back from the property. "The northern pasture is not something you currently have access to. It is good grazing land, adequately watered by the well for horses and a smaller number of cattle. I also have 20 chickens producing eggs that are currently being sold to 3 buyers in town. If you would allow me to move the Vance cattle between your southern pasture and the creek for a period of 6 months, during which time I will organize a proper sale of the full property and all stock, I will grant you grazing rights to the northern pasture for your excess horses or any cattle you want to rotate during that same period. At the conclusion of the 6 months, when the sale is complete, the arrangement ends, and you retain only what the secondary codicil already entitles you to." There was a silence in the feed store. The owner, a thin man with a green apron, had found something extremely interesting to look at on a shelf at the back of the building. "You've been thinking about this since yesterday," Perry said. "I've been thinking about very little else," Theresa said. Perry looked out the door at the street for a moment, then back at her. He picked up the hat he had set on a barrel and turned it once in his hands, which she was beginning to understand was a gesture he made when he was deciding something. "The 6 months," he said. "The cattle sale. You're planning to take the proceeds and go back east." "I am planning to use the proceeds to have options," Theresa said, "which is something I currently do not have." He nodded slowly. "All right," he said. "Here's my counteroffer. 6 months, northern pasture access for my horses, which I need more than I need more cattle grazing. I'll also provide a hand to help Caleb Prout during the roundup and sorting when you're ready to sell, because you're going to need more than one man for that job. In return, the Vance cattle use my southern pasture and creek access for the duration. At the end of 6 months, we either extend if circumstances require it, or the sale proceeds as you've described, and we part ways with the terms of the codicil intact." Theresa looked at him for a moment. "That's more generous than I was expecting," she said, which was honest. "I know what it looks like to be left without information you needed," he said. He said it without particular emphasis, but something in it landed with weight. She filed that away too. "Then we have an agreement," she said, and extended her hand. He shook it. His hand was large and rough with work, and the handshake was brief and businesslike, but he did not grip in the condescending way some men did with women, as though they expected her hand to shatter. He gripped it the way he would have gripped another man's hand, which she found she appreciated. The weeks that followed were the hardest and the strangest of Theresa Garrison's life, and they were also, in ways she would only be able to articulate much later, among the most vivid. She moved into the Vance house at the end of her third day in Millhaven, having paid Mrs. Holt for the nights she had stayed and thanked her genuinely. The house was clean but empty in the way that recently dead people's houses are empty, all the objects still in their places but the animating presence gone, so that everything felt slightly like a stage set. She found her uncle's personal effects modest and without much sentiment. He had been a practical man with no photographs and very few books, which told her something about the years of loneliness he must have lived out here, though she could not be certain of that interpretation. Caleb Prout lived in a small room off the barn and appeared to be deeply relieved that she was not going to immediately sell off everything and leave him stranded. He was gruff but not unfriendly, and he began very patiently answering her questions about how the operation worked. She asked a great many questions. She had found that the most efficient path through ignorance was to identify someone who knew what you did not and ask them everything. She learned about cattle in the way you learn anything when your circumstances make it a matter of survival rather than choice, which is to say, she learned fast and without the luxury of finding it dull. She learned about longhorns and their particular stubbornness, and about reading the sky for weather, and about the difference between good grass and grass that had been overgrazed, and about why the position of the creek mattered so much to an animal's daily range. She also, and this was not something she had planned for or expected, began to see Perry Donnelly regularly. He came to the property twice in the first week to work out the practical logistics of the grazing arrangement. He brought one of his ranch hands, a young man named Marcus who was perhaps 20, and moved cattle with an intuitive grace that Theresa watched with the interest of someone who is learning. He was businesslike about these visits but not cold, and he had a habit of explaining things in plain language without making her feel that the explanation was condescending, which was not as common a quality in men as it should have been. On his second visit, she offered him coffee from the blue enamel pot she had found in her uncle's kitchen, and he accepted, and they sat on the covered porch in the late afternoon and he told her, unprompted, a little about the land. "Your uncle's northern pasture runs up against a line of live oaks that marks where the water table is close to the surface," he said, "which is why the well is reliable even in dry summers. The soil there holds moisture differently than the southern ground. That land would be good for a kitchen garden if you had a mind to plant one." "I won't be here long enough for a kitchen garden," she said. He glanced at her sideways over the rim of his coffee cup. "No," he said, "I suppose not." He asked about Cincinnati. She told him about the school where she had taught, about the particular pleasure of helping a child understand something they had not understood before, about the city's noise and density. He listened the way some people listen, not waiting for his turn to talk, but actually taking in what she said. He told her about how he had come to Texas. He was from Missouri originally, from a farm outside St. Louis, and he had come south and west in 1876 when he was 24, following a cousin who had claimed there was money to be made in cattle. The cousin had gone back to Missouri within a year. Perry had stayed, accumulated land in the particular slow and determined way of someone who knows what he wants and is willing to work for it without resentment. He had built the Doubleday up from 100 acres and 12 head to the 800 acres and significant herd it was now, Over 6 years of work that had aged his hands and his face, but seemed, as far as Theresa could observe, to have left his spirit in good condition. "You came alone," she said. "No family." "No family," he agreed. "My parents passed when I was 18, cholera. I have a sister in St. Louis who writes at Christmas." "I'm sorry about your parents," Theresa said. "It was a long time ago," he said. Which was the thing people said when they had made their peace with something without entirely forgetting it. "My mother died when I was 20, she said. "My father is still living in Dayton. We are not close. He remarried within the year, which was his right, but..." She stopped. "Well, I came west," she said, which was a kind of shorthand for several things she did not want to explain in full. Perry looked at her for a moment. "That is a recognizable sort of sentence," he said. "The kind that ends without finishing because the rest of it doesn't require words." "Yes," she said, surprised that he had understood it. The coffee was gone, and the light was going golden and low over the western pasture. He stood up and thanked her for the coffee, and said he would send Marcus over on Thursday to help Caleb move the cattle to the better portion of the southern pasture before the weekend. He put on his hat and walked to his horse with that same easy competence and rode away. And Theresa sat on the porch for a while longer, watching the sky change and thinking about things she had not expected to be thinking about. The third week brought trouble, as trouble tends to arrive in the West, quickly and from an unexpected direction. A man named Croft Sally appeared at her door on a Wednesday morning. He was a heavy-set man with a prosperous look that had the particular quality of prosperity that has been pursued without too much concern for the methods involved. He had a round, florid face and a smile that did not connect meaningfully to his eyes, and he represented himself as a buyer. "I've heard you're looking to sell the Vance property," he said, standing on her porch with his hat in his hands and his smile deployed at full force. "I haven't placed any advertisement," Theresa said. "Word travels in a small county," Sally said. "I want you to know I'm prepared to make a very fair offer. $800 for the house, the northern acreage, and the cattle." Theresa looked at him. She had been learning the value of things since she arrived in Millhaven, because understanding value was the only way to make good decisions with limited resources. She had talked to Caleb about what the property was worth. She had talked to a man at the general store who had been in the county for 30 years and knew land prices. She had made inquiries in her careful and systematic way, because she was not a woman who liked to be caught without information a second time. $800 for what she had was not a fair offer. It was less than half of what the property was worth. "That is generous of you to come by," she said. "I am not ready to sell at this time." The smile did not waver. "I can go to $850, he said. "I'd like to wrap this up quickly and I'm prepared to pay cash." "Mr. Sally," she said, "I am not interested. Good morning." He stood on her porch for a moment longer than he should have, which told her something about the nature of his respect for the word no, and then he replaced his hat and went away. She told Perry about it 2 days later when he came to check on the cattle arrangements. She watched his face as she described Sally and the offer and the way he had stood on her porch. Something went very still in Perry's expression. "Croft Sally," he said. "You know him." "I know of him," Perry said carefully. "He is a man who has acquired several properties in this county over the past few years at prices that the sellers later came to regret. He has a particular interest in water." "The well," Theresa said. "More likely the position of the property relative to the road that the county is planning to improve next year," Perry said. "The Vance land sits right along the route. That road gets improved, access to town becomes easier, and the land value increases considerably. Sally is trying to buy before that information becomes widely known." Theresa felt a cold clarity settle over her. "And you know about the road," she said. "I do," Perry said, meeting her eyes directly. "I want to be honest with you about that. I knew about the road when I came to the courthouse that first day. I want you to know that my knowledge of it did not change the terms I offered you, because I made those terms before I knew your exact situation, and they reflected what I thought was a fair arrangement between two neighboring operations." She studied him. "If you had wanted to exploit the situation, you would not have told me about Sally's likely motive," she said. "No," he agreed. "I would not have." She believed him. She was not sure she should trust her own judgment entirely on that question, given that she had trusted Raymond Colby in Cincinnati, and that had not served her well. But she believed him. "How much will the road improvement affect the land value?" she asked. "If the property is sold after the road is complete, or even after the announcement is official, you could reasonably expect a buyer to pay twice what Sally offered you this morning. Possibly more if you can present the full operation including water access as a going concern." "Which brings us back to the codicil," Theresa said. "Which brings us back to the codicil," Perry agreed, and his voice carried something in it that was not quite apology but was adjacent to it. She looked out over the northern pasture, where two of his horses were grazing contentedly. "When will the road announcement be official?" 3 months, maybe 4, she calculated. "That falls within our 6-month arrangement." "Yes," he said, "it does." She turned and looked at him fully. "Mr. Donnelly, if you wanted to acquire this property at a favorable price, you are in a considerably better position to do so than Croft Sally. You have the water rights already. You have the southern pasture. If I sell to you before the announcement at a price that reflects what I know now rather than what will be known in 4 months, you benefit enormously." Perry held her gaze without blinking. "Yes," he said, "I do. And yet you just told me about the road." "Yes," he said, "I did." The space between those words and the next several seconds had a particular weight to it, as though the air had developed a slight density. "Why?" she asked. He looked at her for a long moment. The wind moved through the live oaks at the north edge of the pasture, and the horses moved slowly through the grass. "Because you came here without full information once already," he said, "and I am not willing to be the second man who takes advantage of that." Theresa turned back to look at the pasture and was quiet for a long moment. Something had shifted in the situation, something that had nothing to do with property values or legal codicils. "I appreciate that," she said finally, in a voice that was slightly quieter than her usual voice. "You don't have to," he said. "I know I don't," she said. "That's precisely why I do." May gave way to June in Millhaven with the particular intensity of Texas heat arriving like an uninvited guest who intended to stay. Theresa learned to be up and moving before 7 each morning, and to manage the midday hours with shade and water. She wore a wide-brimmed hat she bought at the general store for 35 cents, and she let her skin find its own accommodation with the sun, which it did, darkening gradually from the pale schoolteacher's complexion she had arrived with to something warmer and more accustomed. She began to know the property in the way you know a place only when you have lived with it through weather and difficulty. She knew which boards on the porch would creak underfoot in the pre-dawn dark. She knew that the chickens were predictably indignant about being approached from the left side of the coop. She knew that the well rope had a fray at the 2-foot mark that would eventually need replacing, and that the mule, whose name was apparently Judah according to Caleb, had very decided opinions about which of the 3 working horses he was willing to stand near. She had stopped counting the days as days, until something, and had started experiencing them as simply days, which was a shift she noticed only once it had already happened. Perry came twice a week, on Tuesdays and Fridays, to manage the logistics of his horses in the northern pasture and to check on the cattle arrangement. These visits had a natural structure that evolved without either of them designing it. He would arrive, they would walk the property together and discuss practical matters, and then they would end up on the porch with coffee or water depending on the heat, and they would talk. They talked about a great many things. She told him about the student she had loved most, a girl named Clara who had been so desperate to learn to read that she had practiced at night by the light of a candle burned down almost to its base, a boy named Edmund who had understood mathematics intuitively and used it to solve problems of daily life in ways that delighted her. He told her about the early years on the Doubleday, sleeping in the barn the first winter because the house was barely habitable, learning from neighboring ranchers whose knowledge of the land was the product of generations. He told her about a drought in 1878 that had nearly broken him. He had lost a third of his herd in 5 weeks and had sat on the dry ground next to a tank that had become nothing but cracked mud, and understood for the first time that the land did not care about his plans or his investment or his determination. It did what it did, and you either adapted or you failed. He had adapted. That kind of experience changes how you think about things, Theresa said. It changes what you are willing to lose, he said, and it changes what you realize you were always holding too loosely. She looked at him. What do you mean? He was quiet for a moment, looking at the horizon. I had been so focused on building the operation, on the cattle count and the acreage and the profit at the end of the season, that I had not really noticed I was doing all of it without anyone to share it with. The drought made that feel different. When things go wrong alone, you understand the weight of alone in a way you don't when things are going well. Theresa turned her coffee cup slowly in her hands. I know that weight, she said. I thought you might, he said quietly. She did not look at him. She looked at the pasture, but she was acutely aware of the 3 feet of space between them on the porch bench, and aware that it was 3 feet when it could have been 6. She did not examine that awareness too closely. She was still maintaining the position internally that she was here for 6 months, and then she would have options, and the options would take her somewhere. She did not let herself think too specifically about what somewhere meant. But somewhere was implicitly not here, not Millhaven, Texas, not this porch. The letter from Cincinnati arrived at the end of her 5th week in Millhaven, and it came from Raymond Colby, and it was, if she had not already been thoroughly disillusioned about Mr. Colby's character, the thing that would have completed that disillusionment. He wrote to inform her that a buyer had emerged for the Vance property through his office, a buyer prepared to offer a fair and expedient price, and that given the complications of her current situation he strongly recommended, she authorize him to negotiate on her behalf. The buyer, whom he did not name, was prepared to offer $950 for the house, the northern acreage, and whatever cattle and stock remained. Theresa read this letter 3 times. Then she put it on the kitchen table and looked at it. Croft Sally. The unnamed buyer was Croft Sally, operating through a Cincinnati lawyer, probably with a finder's fee arrangement that would benefit Colby directly. The secondary codicil that Colby had failed to mention in their original meeting, which had sent her out here with incomplete information, now made complete and ugly sense. Colby had known about it. Colby had been in contact with someone, possibly Sally, who wanted the property. By sending her out here without full information, perhaps thinking she would arrive, discover the complications, and be so overwhelmed that she would accept any offer that removed her from the situation, Colby had been setting a trap. And here was the second jaw of the trap, now that the first one had failed to close. She sat with that understanding for a long time. Then she took her small writing kit from the trunk at the foot of her bed, and she wrote a very careful letter back to Mr. Colby. She thanked him for his concern. She informed him that she was managing the estate directly and did not require his assistance. She told him that she had become aware of the secondary codicil, and that she considered his failure to inform her of it prior to her departure to constitute a serious professional deficiency. She did not threaten him with anything because she did not currently have the resources or the standing to back a threat. But she used language that made clear she understood exactly what had happened, and that she was not the overwhelmed and isolated person he appeared to have assumed she was. She sealed the letter. She would mail it from town in the morning. She was still sitting at the kitchen table with the sealed letter in front of her when she heard a horse and looked out the window and saw Perry coming up the track. It was not Tuesday or Friday. It was a Thursday. She went to the door. "I heard something," he said from the saddle, looking down at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before. It was a careful expression. "From someone in town. There's a lawyer named Sally been sending letters about the Vance property through an office in Cincinnati." Not a lawyer, Theresa said. Sally is the buyer. There's a lawyer named Colby in Cincinnati facilitating it. Come in. He came in. She gave him the letter she had received, and he read it and set it on the table with the same controlled steadiness she had come to associate with him when he was dealing with something that required restraint. "What are you going to do?" he asked. "I've already done it," she said, and showed him the reply she had written. He read it. When he looked up at her, there was something warm in his face that had not been visible before, or that she had not allowed herself to see before. "Theresa," he said. It was the first time he had used her given name. He appeared to realize it the moment it was out of his mouth, and she watched him decide not to apologize for it, which was the right decision. "You did not let yourself be pushed into anything. I want you to know I would have helped you if you had needed it." "I know," she said. "I didn't need it." "No," he said. "You didn't." He was quiet for a moment. "For what it's worth, the road announcement is expected in about 6 weeks. I had that from the county commissioner himself this morning. If you can hold until then and present the property properly, you are looking at a sale price that will genuinely change your situation." 6 weeks, she said. 6 weeks. She looked at the sealed letter on the table, then at him. He was standing in her uncle's kitchen in the late afternoon light, hat in his hands again, and she thought that this was not a man who played games with other people's vulnerability. He was, against everything she had learned to expect, precisely what he appeared to be. "I'll hold," she said. He nodded. He stayed for coffee, and they talked on the porch until the light was gone. And when he rode away, she sat in the dark for a while thinking about the strange geography of trust, about how you could be betrayed by someone who should have been reliable and protected by someone who had every reason to be otherwise. It was the first night in Millhaven that she fell asleep quickly, without the long, silent inventory of worries she had been conducting every night since she arrived. The announcement about the road improvement came in 7 weeks, not 6, and it came with the particular force of official news in a small community, which is to say it was the only conversation anyone was having for several days. Theresa was ready for it. She had spent those 7 weeks preparing the property for sale with the systematic efficiency that was her greatest natural talent. She had repaired the fence boards that needed repairing. She had persuaded Caleb to whitewash the outside of the house, which he did with what Theresa had learned to recognize as his version of enthusiasm, which was to say he complained throughout the process, but did an extremely thorough job. She had organized a proper inventory of all cattle, horses, and equipment on the property, with estimated values she had gathered from multiple sources to ensure accuracy. She had also, and this she had thought about carefully, gone to speak with the county commissioner herself about the timing and precise alignment of the road project. She came away with a clear picture of how the access improvement would affect property values in the immediate area, and she used that information in the materials she prepared for prospective buyers. She listed the property for $2,200. This was a number she had arrived at through careful calculation and a reasonable understanding of what the land, the house, the water, and the access improvement together were actually worth, and it was a number she was prepared to defend. Perry, when she told him, looked at her with that warm directness that she had stopped pretending she did not respond to. "That is an accurate price," he said. "I know," she said. 2 years ago I would have told you it was high. 2 years ago the road was not being improved." "No," he agreed. "It was not." They were standing in the northern pasture, and his horses were moving through the grass around them, and the sky was the particular deep blue of a Texas afternoon in late summer, and Theresa Garrison was thinking about something she had been not quite allowing herself to think about for several weeks. "Perry," she said. She had started using his given name somewhere around week 4 and had not made a formal decision about it. It had simply happened the way things happen when they are the natural consequence of accumulated time and honesty. "When this sells." "When the estate is settled." "Yes," he said. I keep starting to plan what comes next, she said, and I keep finding that the plan doesn't go anywhere specific. He was looking at her with a stillness that was completely attentive. That might be telling you something, he said. It might, she said. Or it might be that I have not been thinking clearly because the circumstances have been complicated. What would thinking clearly look like in your estimation? He asked. She turned and looked at the northern pasture, at the solid limestone house at its far edge, at the live oaks in the distance. She was aware of standing next to this man in a way that had the quality of something that had been true for a while and had simply not yet been spoken. I don't know what I expected to feel about this place, she said. I expected to feel like a stranger settling a stranger's business, and I do feel some of that, but I also feel. She stopped. What? He asked quietly. I feel like something here has been mine, she said. Not just in the legal sense, in the other sense. The sense you mean when you say a place fits you. Perry was quiet for a long moment. The horses moved through the grass. A meadowlark somewhere in the oaks produced 4 clear notes. I have a piece of land on the eastern edge of the Doubledy, he said. It borders this property, about 40 acres, very good grass, well watered by a spring. I have not built on it because I have not had a reason to build on it. I kept thinking I would know when I had the reason. She looked at him. I think I know now, he said. He was not looking at the land, he was looking at her. I am not asking you to stay for the land, or because of any practical arrangement, or because the circumstances make it convenient. I am asking because in 8 weeks you have become the person I talk to, and I cannot currently construct a picture of my life without that, and I do not want to try. Theresa had prepared, in her careful internal way, for many possible developments in Millhaven, Texas. She had prepared for legal complications and dishonest buyers and difficult weather and the practical learning curve of running a ranch. She had not prepared for this, and she found that the absence of preparation was not frightening. It was the opposite of frightening. It felt like the moment just before you understand something you have been approaching from a distance, when the shape finally becomes clear. I have $42, she said, which was not what she meant but was the thing that came out first, perhaps because she had said it once before in this man's presence, and it had been the most honest thing she had said that day. You have a great deal more than that, he said, but also if it were still true I would not consider it relevant to the question. What question? She said. Whether you might want to stay, he said, near here, nearby. She looked at him for a long time in the afternoon light. He waited without pressure, without expectation declared, simply with the patient attentiveness that was as much a part of him as the calloused hands, and the hat he turned in those hands when he was deciding something. Yes, she said, I might. The expression that moved across his face then was not triumph or relief, but something gentler and more careful, the expression of a man who has been hoping for something he was not entirely sure he deserved, and has found that hope met with a yes that was freely given. I am not a person who makes decisions without thinking, she said. I want you to know that this is not a reaction to the circumstances. It is not because I have no better options. I have or will have once the sale is complete actual options, real ones, and I am choosing this. I know, he said. I would not have asked if I had thought it was the former. She reached out and took the hat from his hands because it was there between them and she wanted it out of the way, and she set it on her own head where it sat at a ridiculous angle because it was made for a considerably larger skull, and Perry Donnelly laughed. It was the first time she had heard him laugh, a genuine, unguarded laugh that changed the whole architecture of his face, and she thought it was one of the best sounds she had heard in a long time. Awful, she said, about the hat. Completely terrible, he agreed. She handed it back to him. He put it on. He reached out and touched her face with his right hand very gently, just his fingertips against her cheekbone, and she turned her face slightly into the touch the way you turn toward warmth. He kissed her in the northern pasture of the Vance, a state with the horses moving around them and the meadowlark still doing its work in the live oaks. And it was a careful and honest kiss from a man who was not in a hurry and not performing anything. And Theresa, who had kissed a man once before, and found it ultimately empty, discovered that the difference between the two experiences was the difference between a word read in isolation and the same word placed in the sentence where it belongs. The sale of the Vance estate was finalized in the third week of September, 1882. The buyer was a family named Whitfield who had come west from Georgia and wanted to run a small cattle and farming operation. They paid $2,150, which was $50 below asking price, and Theresa accepted because they were good people who would work the land properly, and because the negotiation had lasted 3 days and she was satisfied with the outcome. She watched them come with their wagon and their children and their absolute attention to everything around them, the attention of people looking at their future, and she felt something that was entirely clean. The proceeds, after the outstanding debts of the estate were settled, came to just over $1,700. This was more money than Theresa had held in one place in her entire life. She deposited it at the bank in Millhaven with a banker named Aldrich who was surprised by the amount and tried not to show it and failed completely, and she found she did not mind his surprise. She moved out of the Vance house in the last week of September and moved in temporarily with Eugenia Holt, who was pleased to have her back and who had very definite opinions about Perry Donnelly, that she deployed with the particular enthusiasm of someone who had been waiting to deploy them. "That man has had nobody to talk to properly in 6 years," Mrs. Holt said, setting a cup of coffee on the table in front of Theresa with the decisive certainty that characterized everything she did. "He has worked himself half to death on that ranch, and every woman with sense in the county has noticed, and every woman has found him very agreeable to look at, and not one of them has ever gotten further than a polite good morning from him. And then you arrive, and within 2 months he is riding out to that Vance property twice a week minimum for purposes that have very little to do with cattle management. He was managing his horses," Theresa said. "He was managing his feelings, Mrs. Holt said, which is a more complicated operation and one he does not appear to have much prior experience with." Theresa drank her coffee and did not correct this assessment because it was essentially accurate. She and Perry had their first actual disagreement in the second week of October, and it was instructive because of how it resolved. The disagreement was about where she would live. He wanted to offer her the use of the foreman's house at the Doubleday, which was vacant, so that she would be on nearby land while the new house on the Eastern 40 was being built. She understood his reasoning but found the arrangement uncomfortable because she was not his employee, and moving onto his property before they had a formal understanding seemed to compress the sequence of things in a way that she was not comfortable with. "I need to do this properly," she said. They were sitting in Mrs. Holt's front parlor, which Mrs. Holt had vacated with strategic timing, and the evening light was making long shadows across the floor. "That matters to me. I respect that," he said. "What does properly mean, specifically, in your understanding?" "It means that before I live on your land I would need to be your wife," she said. She said it plainly, as a statement of her own requirements, not as a demand directed at him. She wanted him to understand the distinction. He looked at her with an expression she had not seen before. It had the quality of something that has been waiting to be said finally finding its moment. "Theresa," he said, "I was already planning to ask you to marry me. I was waiting because I did not want to rush you, and because the practical matters of the estate seemed to need to resolve first. But if it would help clarify things, Perry," she said, "yes, ask me." He looked at her steadily in the parlor light and he said, without preamble or elaborate speech, "Will you marry me?" "Yes," she said. He reached across the space between them and took her hand, and they sat like that for a while in Mrs. Holt's front parlor, the schoolteacher from Cincinnati and the rancher from Missouri who had both come to Texas and found what they had not been looking for, which is the best kind of finding there is. They were married on the 4th of November, 1882, in the small Methodist church on Millhaven's Main Street. The ceremony was conducted by a minister named Reverend Aldous Fitch, who had a kind face and a tendency to cry at weddings that he had entirely given up being embarrassed about. Caleb Prout attended and cleaned up to a degree that suggested the occasion had made a significant impression on him. Marcus, Perry's young hand, was there in a coat that appeared to have been borrowed from someone considerably larger. Mrs. Holt wore a hat with a feather in it and wept in a way that she would have described as dignified, and that was perfectly well-intentioned if not precisely that. Theresa wore a dress she had ordered from a catalog through the general store. It was a deep blue wool, well made, with a fitted bodice and practical long sleeves, because it was November and she was a practical woman. She had put her hair up properly, and she carried a small bunch of late-season wildflowers that she had picked herself from the edge of the northern pasture on one of her last visits to the property, before the Whitfields took possession. Perry stood at the front of the church in his best dark coat and his good boots, and looked at her walking toward him with the expression of a man who cannot quite believe the specific quality of his luck, and is trying to deserve it. They said their vows clearly and without stumbling. When Reverend Fitch pronounced them married and Perry kissed her, Mrs. Holt cried so enthusiastically that she required Marcus's borrowed coat arm to lean on, which Marcus bore with an expression of touching seriousness. The new house took 4 months to build, which was faster than Perry had anticipated because he hired 2 additional carpenters from Millhaven, and because Theresa was involved in the planning from the beginning in a way that kept the decisions moving. She knew what she wanted in a house, and she said so clearly, and Perry listened and incorporated her ideas into the design with the cheerful practicality of a man who had spent years making decisions alone and found collaboration a considerable improvement. The house went up on the eastern 40 acres of the Doubleday through November and December and into the new year, which brought rain, and then a cold stretch, and then warmer days that let the carpenters make up for lost time. Theresa lived with Eugenia Holt through this period and rode out to the building site every few days to see progress, and Perry was always there when she arrived, having absorbed some of the natural impatience of a man waiting for his life to fully begin. They spent those months continuing to learn each other in the particular way of 2 people who have committed to a future together, and are filling in the texture of each other's daily existence. She discovered that he woke before dawn habitually, and could be reliably found at the kitchen table of the main ranch house with coffee and whatever paperwork required his attention before the day's physical work began. He discovered that she had opinions about everything, and that her opinions were worth listening to, and that she delivered them with a directness that occasionally startled people who were not expecting it from a woman of her apparent composure. She wrote to her father in Dayton. It was a careful letter, honest but not accusatory, telling him that she had married a rancher in Texas and was making a life, and that she hoped he was well. He wrote back, eventually, in the formal and slightly bewildered way of a man who has not quite understood his daughter for some years, and has only recently begun to suspect this might be his own deficiency. It was not a warm letter, but it was a genuine one, and Theresa filed it in the small wooden box where she kept correspondence, and thought that perhaps the distance, both geographical and emotional, was something that could be slowly bridged over time. She wrote a letter to Raymond Colby in Cincinnati that she did not send until the deed to the Donnelly property was in her name alongside Perry's, and which informed him with measured precision that she had settled the Vance estate at a price that reflected its actual value, that she had become aware of the full circumstances of her departure from Cincinnati, and that she had engaged a local attorney named Mr. Reardon, who happened to be a former member of the Ohio Bar, to review whether Colby's conduct in the matter met the standards of his professional obligation. She did not know what would come of that letter. What she knew was that sending it felt like the closing of a door that had been left inappropriately ajar. She moved into the new house in March of 1883, with Perry, and with the furniture they had chosen together from the catalog, and from the furniture maker in Millhaven who did custom work and whose name was Harmon, and who was deeply proud of the kitchen table he built them, which was solid oak and large enough for a family considerably bigger than 2 people. The first evening in the house, they cooked supper together, which was a simple meal of beans and cornbread and salt pork, and they sat at Harmon's oak table and ate it, and Theresa looked at the walls and the windows and the light coming through them and felt something she had been trying to name for months finally give itself a name. Home. Not the house in Cincinnati where she had grown up, not the hotel room or even the Vance house. This. "You are very quiet," Perry said. "I am very content," she said. He reached across the table and took her hand and held it, and they finished their meal like that. And then he washed the dishes because she had cooked, which was a division of labor they had arrived at naturally, and that both of them found entirely reasonable. Spring came to Millhaven with the force and color it always does in Texas, sudden and extravagant, and Theresa planted the kitchen garden that Perry had predicted the first week they met, on the east side of the house where the soil held moisture well. She planted beans and corn and tomatoes and herbs, working with the careful attention she brought to anything she decided to do well, and she found that the work of putting things in the ground and watching them come up had a satisfaction that was unlike any other kind of satisfaction she had encountered. It was slow and fundamental, and it required patience and rewarded attention. Caleb Prout had stayed on with the Whitfields and seemed to be getting along well with them, which Theresa was glad of. Marcus had taken on more responsibility at the Doubleday and was turning into a reliable hand with a real future in ranching if he chose it. The operation ran with the particular organized efficiency that Perry had built over 6 years, and that Theresa was now integrated into, not in the way of a silent partner, but in the way of someone who understood the full picture and contributed to decisions accordingly. She had been thinking about the school. Millhaven had a schoolhouse that was used inconsistently because the schoolteacher who had been there left in 1881, and the county had not secured a replacement. There were children in and around the town whose education was being conducted by their parents with varying degrees of effectiveness, and there were some whose education was not being conducted at all. She had observed this situation since her first weeks in town and had filed it in the part of her mind where she kept things that mattered. She brought it up to Perry in April, sitting on the porch of the new house in the evening after supper, watching the spring darkness come in from the east. "I would like to teach," she said. "The schoolhouse is empty and there are children who need instruction. I would not be doing it for the money, though a small wage would be a practical matter to negotiate. I would be doing it because it is what I do well and because there is a clear need." Perry looked at her with the expression she had come to love most on his face, which was the expression of a man thinking carefully about something and finding his way to an honest answer. "It would mean time away from the house during the school week," he said. "Yes," she said. "I have no objection to that," he said. "I would want you to be careful about the road in winter." "I have ridden worse roads than the one to town," she said. "That is certainly true," he said. "Talk to the commissioner about the schoolhouse. If it needs repairs, I'll help with that." She talked to the county commissioner, who was a man named Blevins and who was deeply relieved to have the problem solved without requiring him to do very much about it. She inspected the schoolhouse and made a list of what was needed. Perry and Marcus spent a weekend repairing the roof and rehung the door that had swollen in its frame. Mrs. Holt organized what she called a community contribution of supplies, which resulted in a delivery of chalk and a sufficient quantity of slates and some basic readers that had been sitting in a back room of the church. Theresa opened the school in May of 1883 with 14 students ranging from 6 to 14 years of age, and the particular quality of that first morning, watching their faces come in through the door with the mixture of wariness and hope that children bring to new situations, was something she could not have adequately described to anyone who had not felt it themselves. She was exactly where she was supposed to be. In July, she and Perry were sitting at the kitchen table after supper working through the books for the Doubleday's summer season, which was something they did together every few weeks as a way of keeping the picture clear, when Theresa looked up from the ledger and said, "I think we are going to have a child." Perry set down his pencil. He looked at her with an expression that moved through several things quickly and arrived somewhere warm and full and a little awed. "How certain are you?" he said. "Quite," she said. He pushed the ledger aside and came around the table, and she stood up, and he held her with the particular care of a man who has been given something he was afraid to hope for. She held on to him in the solid and genuine way that was her own version of the same feeling. "A child," he said into her hair. "In the spring, I think," she said. "February or March." The school will manage," she said. "Mrs. Holt has said several times that she would enjoy helping with instruction. I think she means it." "She does," Perry said. "She is constitutionally incapable of not meaning things she says." They stood like that in the kitchen for a long while, and then they sat back down and finished the ledger because the books needed doing. But the quality of the room had changed in the way it changes when the future becomes suddenly more specific and more vivid and more real. The autumn of 1883 was full and busy and good. The school thrived in the way things thrive when someone puts real care into them. Theresa's students arrived reliably every morning and left in the afternoon carrying knowledge that they had not had in the morning. And this seemed to Theresa one of the most satisfying processes she knew how to be part of. The child that was coming was making itself known in the usual ways of pregnancy, which she navigated with the same composed practicality she brought to everything, though Perry was considerably less composed about it than she was, and had developed a new attentiveness to her comfort that was very endearing and occasionally mildly excessive. "I am not fragile," she said one evening when he had rearranged her chair cushions for the third time. "I know that," he said. "I am not doing this because I think you are fragile." "What are you doing it for then?" He sat down beside her and put his arm around her, and she leaned into him because it was evening, and she was tired in the particular deep way of late pregnancy. "I am doing it," he said, "because in approximately 4 months there will be a small person in this house, and I will spend the rest of my life being somewhat terrified about it and also entirely grateful. And in the meantime cushion arrangement is within my control." She laughed. She laughed a great deal in those months, which was not something she had expected as one of the defining qualities of her life in Millhaven, Texas. She wrote to her father again in November and told him about the baby coming. He wrote back more quickly this time, and the letter was warmer than the previous ones. He said that her mother would have been glad to see her well settled. It was the most personal thing he had said to her in years, and she read it twice and then put it in the wooden box and thought that people could, slowly and with effort, change the quality of what they offered each other. The baby came on the 21st of February, 1884, in the middle of a cold night that had that particular West Texas quality of cold, dry and crystalline and absolute. Mrs. Holt was there, which was as inevitable as anything that had ever happened, and the Millhaven doctor, a meticulous man named Dr. Calvin, who had delivered perhaps 100 babies in his career and treated each one with the same intense focus as if it were the first. Perry waited in the front room of the house and was, by all accounts including his own, barely functional. The baby was a boy. He was small and red-faced and emphatic about his arrival, which seemed appropriate. They named him Harold James Donnelly. Harold for the uncle who had brought Theresa here, whose estate she had come to settle, and whose unknowing legacy had changed the shape of her life entirely. James for Perry's father, whose name he had carried and whose loss he had carried too for a long time. Perry held his son in the early morning hours with the careful astonishment of a man who has understood something about the word irreversible, that there are changes in your life which are so complete and so good that the before and after are two different countries. He looked from the baby to Theresa, who was exhausted and fully present, and watching him with eyes that knew exactly what she was looking at. "Harold James," Perry said quietly to the baby. The baby expressed no particular opinion about the name, but did grip Perry's finger with the decisive strength of someone who has decided, after consideration, that this is the right hand to hold. Millhaven in the years that followed became the place where Theresa Garrison had built a life of a kind she had not been able to imagine when she was sitting in Raymond Colby's overheated office on Vine Street in Cincinnati, reading a letter about a stranger's estate and calculating whether she could afford the train ticket. The school grew. By 1886, she had 23 students and a second teacher, a young woman named Adeline who had come to Millhaven from San Antonio with a teaching certificate and a formidable aptitude for mathematics. Theresa kept the school going through the county's good years and its difficult ones, because she had learned from the land itself that persistence through difficult seasons was what made the good ones mean something. The Double D grew as well. Perry expanded the operation steadily and without overreach, in the careful way of a man who has learned to understand the difference between opportunity and overextension. They talked about the ranch the same way they talked about everything together, with the full information on the table between them. She brought her clear thinking and her systematic approach to decisions that had previously been his alone, and he brought his deep knowledge of the land and the animals and the particular rhythms of ranching in this part of Texas. And together, they made better decisions than either of them had made separately, which is what partnership is supposed to do. Harold learned to walk in the spring of his second year, by propelling himself from the porch rail to Perry's outstretched hands in the middle of the yard, falling, getting up, and trying again with the same deliberate determination that Theresa recognized as deeply familiar. She stood on the porch watching this with a feeling in her chest that she thought she would never quite be able to put into adequate words. Their second child, a girl they named Clara, arrived in 1886. The name was Theresa's choice, for the student in Cincinnati who had read by candlelight until the wick burned out, and Perry accepted it without question because he understood what the name was carrying. Clara was loud and opinionated from her first hour of life, and showed no signs of becoming less so, which delighted both her parents and eventually the whole of Millhaven, which was a town that could accommodate a determined person regardless of their age. Croft Sally had long since given up on acquiring the Vance property and had moved his attentions elsewhere. Theresa heard from Eugenia Holt occasionally that he had tried similar tactics on other arriving strangers and met with varied success, and she felt a complicated mixture of residual anger and something like pity for a man whose calculations never seemed to account for the possibility that the person he was trying to exploit might simply refuse to be exploited. Raymond Colby in Cincinnati had received a review from the Ohio bar that had resulted in a formal reprimand, which Mr. Reardon had written to inform her of in the spring of 1883. It was not a catastrophic consequence for Colby, but it was a consequence, and it was recorded, and Theresa found she could close that file entirely after she received Reardon's letter. In the spring of 1888, when Harold was 4 and Clara was 2 and Theresa was 32 years old and Perry was 36, they sat on the porch of the house on the Eastern 40 in an evening that had the quality of Texas spring at its most generous, warm and clear and full of the smell of grass and new growth, and Theresa thought about the list she had made that first night in the Millhaven Hotel. The 2 columns, what she had on the left and what she did not have on the right. The list looked entirely different now. The right column had been methodically, if not deliberately, filled. She had knowledge of this land and this work. She had friends in this town, real ones, Eugenia Holt and Caleb Prout and Marcus and Adeline, and the families of her students. She had a plan that was not a plan but a life, which was better than a plan because it was actually happening. She had a husband who was the most honest person she had encountered in a life that had not always shown her honesty in its most useful forms, who had told her about the road improvement when he could have kept it to himself, who had shaken her hand like a person rather than a category, who turned his hat in his hands when he was deciding something and laughed at jokes she made before she had finished making them, and read the books she recommended and argued with her about things they disagreed about in the direct and fair way of someone who respects the person they are arguing with. Perry came out of the house with 2 cups of coffee and set one beside her and sat down in the chair next to hers. Harold was asleep inside. Clara was asleep. The ranch was quiet in the particular settled way of an evening when the day's work is done. "What are you thinking about?" Perry said. "Lists," she said. He looked at her with a small smile. "Good lists or bad ones?" "The kind," she said, "where you look at what's on the left side and realize the right side has been filled in without you quite noticing it was happening." He reached over and took her hand. She turned hers to hold his properly, the way you hold the hand of someone you have been holding hands with long enough that it is as natural as breathing. "You know what I think about sometimes," he said. "That first day in the courthouse. You walked in looking like someone who had just been told the floor was made of water, and you picked up those papers off the floor and straightened them against the table and looked at me like you were going to get through this situation no matter what you had to do to manage it." "I was terrified," she said. "I know," he said. "That is what was remarkable about it." The coffee was good, and the evening was good, and somewhere in the direction of the live oaks, a meadowlark was producing its 4 clear notes with the reliability of something that does not know it is being listened to and would go on doing it either way. "Perry," she said. "Yes. I think there might be a 3rd child." He was quiet for a moment in the way he was sometimes quiet when he was absorbing something that required a moment to absorb. Then he turned to look at her with the same expression he had produced in this kitchen, in a different house, in a different season years ago when she had first said those words. Warm and full and a little awed exactly as before. "How certain are you?" he said. "Quite," she said. He stood up from his chair and came around and knelt in front of hers, which was not something she had expected, and he took both her hands and looked up at her in the evening light with his face entirely open in the way it only was in moments like this one, when the walls of his habitual reserve came down completely, and what was there underneath was simply and entirely readable. "I am going to love this life for the rest of my life," he said. "I want you to know that." "I know that," she said. "I know you know," he said. "I say it because it is true, and because true things deserve to be said even when they are already known." She leaned forward and kissed him on the forehead and then on the mouth, and the meadowlark continued in the live oaks, and the children slept inside, and the Doubledy lay around them in the evening dark. 800 acres of Texas land that he had built and she had come to, and together they had made into something that was entirely and irrevocably theirs. In the winter of 1888, the 3rd child arrived. Another boy, who they named Thomas after no particular ancestor, but simply because the name suited him, which Perry said was as good a reason as any for a name. Thomas was a round and placid baby who regarded the world with the serene interest of someone who has decided in advance that it is going to be interesting, which was a quality that charmed everyone who met him immediately. Harold, at 4, was deeply uncertain about the new baby's purpose and usefulness, which he expressed with the philosophical directness of a 4-year-old. And Clara, at 2, was entirely welcoming, and attempted to share her dinner with Thomas on multiple occasions, despite the obvious practical difficulties. Theresa managed all of this with the same composed competence she brought to everything, and was never quite sure whether to be amused or touched by Perry's continuing intensity of feeling about each child's arrival, which diminished not at all from one to the next. The school continued. The ranch continued. The town of Millhaven grew in the steady way of towns that have good water and a road that connects to other roads, and the Donnelly family grew with it. Not just in number, but in the rootedness of people who have committed themselves to a particular place, and found the commitment confirmed over and over by the accumulated weight of good years, and difficult ones, and ordinary ones, that are the actual substance of a life. Theresa taught children to read in that schoolhouse for 11 years, and some of them would remember her for the rest of their lives in the specific and lasting way of the teacher, who came along at exactly the right moment. She taught arithmetic and geography and some history, and she taught without condescension and without impatience, because she remembered that she had once arrived somewhere entirely ignorant of everything around her, and had been grateful for the people who explained things in plain language. She wrote, in 1890, a letter to the Ohio Bar Association that was not about Colby, but about the legal situation of women arriving as heirs in the Western Territories, and the ways in which their access to complete information about their own estates was vulnerable to exploitation by lawyers and buyers who expected their unfamiliarity to make them tractable. She did not know what became of the letter. She suspected not very much, because the mechanisms of that kind of change were slow, but she wrote it because the experience had been hers, and she was in a position to describe it clearly and accurately, and silence seemed like the wrong response to that. Perry read the letter before she sent it and said, without elaboration, that it was good. She knew what he meant. They continued for a long time as they had begun, in the honest and practical and genuinely loving way of two people who had found each other through a sequence of events that neither of them had designed, and both of them were grateful for. They disagreed sometimes, as people who are equal in a partnership disagree, and they talked through their disagreements with the directness they had both brought to their very first conversation across an oak table in the Millhaven courthouse. They did not always resolve things immediately, but they always resolved them. Harold grew up to be a rancher, which surprised no one, and Clara grew up to be a schoolteacher in San Antonio, which surprised no one who had known her as a child. Thomas became a lawyer in Austin, which made Theresa think about the circularity of things, about how a woman set loose by a lawyer's failure had raised a son who would go on to practice the law with. She had every confidence, considerably greater honesty than had been applied to her situation 40 years before. And in all those years, in all the seasons of drought and rain and heat and cold, in the years of full barns and lean winters, through the ordinary extraordinary accumulation of a life built in a place that had once been entirely foreign and had become entirely home, Theresa Donnelly sometimes thought about the list she had made that first night in the Millhaven Hotel, with the left column and the right column, the things she had and the things she did not have. She had had $42 and no plan, and a stranger's estate to settle, and no certainty that any of it would come to anything at all. She had found a rancher who had told her about the road when he could have stayed silent, who had shaken her hand properly, who had said, simply and without decoration, "I am not willing to be the second man who takes advantage of that," and had meant it entirely, and had spent the rest of his life meaning it. She had found in the most practical and unpredicted way that the thing she had needed was not options, though options had come. The thing she had needed was a place and a person, both of which had been in Millhaven, Texas, waiting without knowing they were waiting, in the spring of 1882, when she stepped off the train with $42 and a letter about a stranger's estate, and no idea at all that staying was about to become the only thing she wanted to do.